Hey, I'm Kai from Flamenco Explained, and this is the first in a three-part series about dominant chords, or seven chords. We're going to get into that almost right away. Should we even be calling them dominant chords? Basically, we're talking about the chords that look like this, right? Or this. You probably know these. We use them a lot in flamenco. We use them the normal way that dominant chords are used, but we also use them in ways that are more like blues. So we're going to talk about some of that, and we're really going to talk about what is a dominant chord in this video, and then I'm going to show you at the end a little chord progression that will allow you to use a lot of open position voicings that you already know probably to sort of understand what shapes resolve to other shapes, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But the first question is, what is a dominant chord, and should we be calling these dominant chords? And in a way, we probably should not be calling them dominant chords, because dominant is what we call a function. In tonal music, anything that's in a normal major key or minor key, classical, pop, rock, jazz. A scale is harmonized, which means we make chords out of the scales. And then the chords that we make have functions, right? There's the tonic function, which is the kind of like, okay, I'm at rest function. Like, I don't feel the need to move anywhere. And then there's the dominant function. There's also the subdominant, which takes you to the dominant, but we're really concerned about the dominant here. So the dominant function is a chord that really wants to resolve somewhere, right? And in tonal music, it usually wants to resolve to the tonic. So this chord, we can kind of hear da-da-ba-ba, it wants to resolve to there, right? It's basically built into the chord that desire to resolve. And we often will say that a dominant resolves down a fifth or up a fourth, right? This is something you'll hear a lot. So just very quickly, what do we mean by that? If we are resolving to C, right? The dominant of the C major scale is the chord that's built on the fifth degree, right? This is true of any scale, right? So in the case of C major, it would be G, C, D, E, F, G. So that G wants to resolve to C, right? So that's the fifth degree. So if we start on the G, right, and we go up, right, dum bum bum ba, or so la G do, that's up a fourth, right? From G to C, G, A, B, C is up a fourth. If we start on this G, right, sol, fa, mi, re, do, that's a fifth down. So that's what we mean when we say that a dominant wants to resolve up a fourth or down a fifth. And it's kind of nice on the guitar to see that, okay, this is that sort of the baseline of that resolution. Or there's two things that make a dominant really want to resolve. And one of them has to do with the key, right? So if I establish that we're in A by playing some of the chords that naturally happen when we harmonize the A major scale, right now it kind of feels like we're in this key. If I play an E major triad, it feels like it wants to go back to A. I did not play what we call a dominant, well, I did play a dominant chord. I didn't play a 7 chord, right? I played an E, which is the chord that happens on the fifth degree in A. And by establishing this key, all I have to do is play that chord and it wants to resolve. If we make a 7 chord out of that chord on fifth degree, we get what a lot of us call a dominant chord. So this is where I'm going to stop and take a second to make this distinction. A dominant chord is really a chord that serves the dominant function, but a lot of us will call any 7 chord dominant. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is that we talk about seventh chords, which are chords that have 4 notes, right? It could be a minor 7, a major 7, a dominant 7. But if I just say a 7 chord, especially when I'm speaking, if I write it out, it's pretty easy to see what I mean. But if I just say a 7 chord, it can be a little vague. Like, what does that mean, right? If I see C7, I know that that's a C triad with a flat 7, right? We'll talk about that in a minute, how you build a 7 chord. But I'm going to call them dominants, and a lot of us call them dominants just because in speaking it makes it pretty clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this chord quality, right? A chord quality is it's major, it's minor, it's a minor 7, it's a minor 7 flat 5, it's a 7. That's a chord quality. And when I talk about dominance in this video, I'm talking about the chord quality of a 7 chord. But again, because if I say a 7 chord, you're like, 7th chord? What? So I'm going to call them dominants. Not technically, properly correct to do that because of this confusion that I'm talking about, right? A chord that has a dominant function, which could also be a diminished chord, is properly a dominant. But we're talking about these chords, right? So what are these chords? These chords are a major triad with what we call a flat 7, which means that the 7th degree of the scale is lowered from what it would be in a major scale. Now, instead of having you think about a major 7th or a minor 7th, I'm going to show you a trick. If we're playing an E, right, the flat 7 is a whole step below the root. This is really important. You take a major triad and you're adding what we call the flat 7, which is a note that's a whole step below the root. Now, we think of the root as this, right? That E, the lowest note, that's the root. That's the lowest note in the voicing, right? The root is E, so a whole step below any E is going to give us a D, right? So if we take this E, for example, and we go down 2 half steps, a whole step, we get D, which is the flat 7. You don't have to worry about why we got there, but this rule that it's always a whole step below the root will always get you to the flat 7. So if I take this E major triad and I add that D, I now have an E7, right? There's another D here, so I could play it here instead, or I could play both of these Ds, right? The 4th string and 2nd string. It doesn't matter, as long as there's one of them in there, it's an E7. And a chord like this chord quality of the 7 is what we call unstable. It wants to resolve somewhere. It wants to resolve down a 5th or up 4th to the tonic or somewhere else, right? It wants to, but it definitely wants to resolve down a 5th, up a 4th. Not always, right? But almost all of the time. That's kind of our definition of a 7 chord. So these are the chords we're talking about, right? And they serve a bunch of purposes. In a major or a minor key, the main purpose of the dominant is to resolve to the tonic, to the 1 chord, the main chord. So in flamenco, for example, in alegrías, this B always wants to resolve back to that E, right? That's the dominant. And in this case, it's the dominant function and it's a dominant chord, right? So in flamenco, we have alegrías, which is in a major key. We have guajiras, which is in a major key. We have colombianas. We also have some minor key stuff like farruca and the minor family of tangos, like tangos de Málaga, tangos del Piallo, del Titi. So there are a lot of palos in flamenco that are tonal, right? Either in a major or a minor key. And in those keys, and those palos rather, dominants work the way they work in other tonal music. However, dominant chords, 7, this is really where we want to start calling them 7 chords, but I'm going to still call them dominants just because I think it's clearer, can be used as a chord quality that doesn't want to resolve, right? So if you're a guitarist, you've probably played some blues at some point, and you know that all the chords in blues can be 7 chords, right? Or what we call dominant chords. But they're not all serving that dominant function. They're not all wanting to resolve to the tonic, right? The tonic in blues is a 7 chord, right? That doesn't mean it's dying to resolve to somewhere else, right? So that's a different use of a 7 chord that has little to do or, is very different from the way we use it in tonal music. Flamenco uses these 7 chords really similarly, right? So if you just think about your basic progression in Soleá, you're going from A minor to G to F to E, right? These are all triads. If I play 7th chords, right, 4-note chords, I'm going to get an A minor 7, and then I'm going to get a G7, and then I'm going to get an F7, and then I'm going to get my E, right? These chords we're not trying to resolve down a 5th. That's just a chord quality that works in flamenco. So this is a really important distinction between a dominant chord and a 7 chord. As I said, and I'm going to keep repeating, I'm calling them all dominant chords, but properly these are not dominant chords. These are just 7 chords, right? They're chords that are built the way we talked about. You take a major triad, you find the flat 7, right? And you know these shapes probably if you play some guitar. If you're watching this video and you're wondering about dominant chords, you probably know these shapes. So in flamenco, we use them a lot this way. There's a third way that dominants are used both in tonal music and in flamenco, and that's something we call a secondary dominant. And a secondary dominant is a chord that does want to resolve down a fifth, but not to the tonic, right? So it's the dominant of a chord that's not the tonic. So, for example, in Alegrías, right? Very often we go from here when we're playing for the cante, we go to this F sharp minor. And just as often, we play this dominant that resolves to it, right? So this chord is a secondary dominant that wants to resolve to another chord that's in the key, right? So that happens a ton in tonal music. And if you ever hear people talk about the 5 of 4, the 5 of 5, the 5 of 2, that 5 equals the dominant of, because it's the 5th degree, right? So jazzers will talk about 5 of another chord, and that means the dominant of that chord, and it's almost always a chord that's made with notes that aren't necessarily, well, that are necessarily not in the key that we're playing. In flamenco, we use these all the time also, right? So we take this progression, but we can also do the dominant of G, the dominant of F, and then we resolve, right? Or por medio, we'd have D, the dominant of C, the dominant of B flat, and then A, right? So these are dominants that are resolving the way dominants do, and we're using them in flamenco. So 3 different ways of looking at dominance, right? There's the dominant in a tonal key where it resolves to the tonic. There's the way we use them in flamenco, you know, as just a flavor of a chord, right? What we call a chord quality. And then there's secondary dominants, which become really important in the Phrygian keys. If these words mean anything to you, the scale that goes with the dominant chord is the Mixolydian scale. So it's basically a major scale with a lowered 7th degree, that flat 7 I was talking about that we get by going a whole step rather than a half step below the root. That's called a Mixolydian scale. That's built into the major scale. That's in theory. If those words didn't mean anything, just don't worry about them. So finally, we're going to get to the practical thing that I think every guitarist should know, and especially flamenco guitarists, right? One of these shapes that I'm going to show you is kind of specific to flamenco. So it's this progression where we're going to go from B to E to A to D to G to C, and then we're going to go to F, and then it's going to all happen barred, right? So this is really important because these are the shapes you want to know as a guitarist so that you don't have to know all the theory about, you know, what's the dominant of what. That's where it gets really confusing. So rather than say, okay, this is the chord and I want its dominant, right? There's this whole thing I can go through where I'm like, okay, this is a G sharp minor 7, right? The dominant of G sharp is going to be D sharp, so I need to find a D sharp 7. Don't worry about that. If I'm resolving to a chord whose root is here, that shape is going to get me there. And if I happen to be playing G sharp major, the same shape is going to get me there, right? That's the dominant of. We're going to look at this little chord progression, which starts with a B7, right? This is probably how you know it if you're not, you know, playing a lot of flamenco yet. In flamenco, we're going to use a voicing which is this one, right? So rather than play the actual root here, the B, we're going to play the F sharp, the second fret of the 6th string. Or, so we have this version, we have this version, and then there's a very flamenco version which looks like this, which is both, right? I have the F sharp, the B, and then this finger is not in the way of that, right? So I'm actually barring two strings with that finger. So these are 3 ways to play this shape, and that resolves to, right, the E shape, which you'd probably know. Right? Now, if we take the E shape and we make a dominant out of it, we're either going to get this, right, or doesn't matter which one. And that resolves to the A shape, right? We make the A shape into a dominant by playing the open third string. And that resolves to D. Right now, I'm going to show you a different D. Rather than resolve, I'm going to resolve to a first inversion D. If you don't know what a first inversion is, it doesn't matter. Basically what I'm doing is I'm taking this note and playing it on the sixth string instead of the first. So this is the D I'm going to play. And to turn this into a dominant, D, right there's my flat 7. This shape is going to resolve me to the G shape. I'm going to turn G into a dominant by going a whole step below the G to the F. And that's going to resolve me to C. Right? So now we've kind of come full circle. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to show you how this B thing became what it is. And this is a very important dominant shape that we use in flamenco all the time. So this C, in order to make it a dominant, I would add B flat, right? But what we're going to do, we're going to bar, and then we're going to move this finger, right? So that's this chord that we were playing here before, but now it's barred. And if you're confused about what I'm doing, it's this very common C7 shape, we bar, right? So this is a second inversion, C7, but all you have to know, well, two things you want to know. Basically just that it's a C7, but really that this chord, this shape resolves to that root. Right, now we're going to take all the other shapes and the barred version, so the E shape is going to resolve to the A shape. The A shape, right, we're going to turn it into a dominant, is going to resolve to this D shape that I showed you. Right now, we're going to have to rearrange our fingers a little to make this into a dominant. And that's going to resolve to the G shape, which in turn resolves to the C shape. And we start it all over. Right? This shape resolves to this shape. This resolves to this. This resolves to this. This resolves to this. And we're back. So this is the pattern that I want you to learn, because these 5 shapes are incredibly common. You probably know most of these chords already, but once you get the hang of what shape resolves to the other, it becomes very easy for you to play secondary dominants, which are huge in flamenco, right? So if I'm like, oh no, what's the dominant of this chord? Well, the E shape is the dominant of the A shape, right? So I don't have to know the name of this chord, right? So really what we want to do is memorize which shape resolves to which other shape. You're going to learn them in the open position because you probably already know those, but then I really want you to practice them in the barred position because that's how they come up more often. To recap, we call them dominant chords, but they're really 7 chords. And one of the reasons we say dominant is just because if I say 7, that's a little confusing. So these are chords that are major triads with an added flat 7, and generally they want to resolve either down a 5th or up a 4th. But in flamenco, very often, they're just chord qualities, right? Just sounds that work in a non-dominant function. We also use dominants as secondary dominants all over the place in flamenco. And so if you learn these shapes, you're going to have a sense, without needing to know the theory behind it, of what dominants do, what they sound like, and how to use them in a really practical way.